it's important to realize that with a 20-year charter, the Bank of the United States rechartered in 1816. It wouldn't come up until 1836. But you've got these politicians that are now going by the name Whigs, Henry Clay and Daniel Webster. And we'll talk more about who the Whigs are later on. But they wanted to get this new charter renewed before the 36 election. They didn't want to have what happened before, where there's that 5-year gap between 11 and 16. They wanted to make sure that you could hit 36 when it was supposed to be rechartered and just get another recharter. And they assured Nicholas Biddle, who ran the bank, listen, Congress will recharter it. But they were wrong. And in fact, they were incredibly wrong because they actually gave Andrew Jackson the chance to make this a campaign issue and really sort of kill the bank 4 years before it actually would ever come up for actually being rechartered. So right before the 1832 election, they made it a big deal. Like, we are actually going to bring up the recharter 4 years early. We'll have people vote on it. It won't obviously go into effect until 36, but we want everyone to know that it's going to be rechartered. Now, Congress passes the recharter, in part because Nicholas Biddle is giving bribes to them, but it passes. And Clay and Webster and Biddle are so confident. They're like, Andrew Jackson will not veto our recharter because that would cost him the election. But they didn't understand. They didn't really understand that even though he said no, and they thought he'd be alienating all the people in the cities that were his supporters, in reality, the power had really moved out west. So it was a no-brainer for him. He looks at it and he says, this has always been against the little guy. It profits the rich owners over the poor. And even when those politicians tried to get the Senate to override his veto, they couldn't. So effectively, they brought it up early, put it right in his lap, and he killed it. So the bank would have 4 more years, but then there wouldn't be a new one in 1836. Now, Nicholas Biddle, who runs the bank, tries to play hardball. He goes, listen, Botus is going to stop making any loans, all right? It's going to demand that state banks exchange their paper for gold and silver, which they really couldn't do because they didn't have enough gold and silver. And his goal was to bring the economy to like a total standstill and really sabotage it and create a depression and make sure that everybody understood just how important Botus was. Now, ultimately, Andrew Jackson will play his card, which is like, well, I'm going to remove all the money from Botus and I'm going to put it out in what are later known as sort of wildcat banks, these state banks that really multiply once, Botus has effectively been neutered. So there's 4 years where it's there, but it doesn't have much power. These banks that spring up are making really sort of risky loans, many of which we saw banks doing back when there was no bank, 1811, 18 to 1816. It's ultimately going to lead to a panic and a depression in 1837, which we'll talk about at the end of this lecture. So again, Jackson was given an opportunity to kill the bank 4 years early, and he's like, I can't believe you just did this. Of course I am going to say that I don't like it. I've never said I like the bank, and I'm doing this, again, for the common man. Now, in vetoing that bill, it was not uncommon for Jackson. Jackson actually vetoed 12 bills, which is more than all the previous presidents combined. Washington, Adams, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, and John Quincy Adams. Now, Jackson said he was doing this because congressmen represented local areas, and so they were very provincial in their thinking, whereas he represented all of the people. So he was thinking about everybody when he made these decisions in overruling Congress. Now we're going to find ourselves in the last of the Jackson Three, and that's the nullification crisis. And this has to do with South Carolina and a tariff. And South Carolina had really suffered after the Panic of 1819, as had most cotton-growing areas, because, again, cotton prices had gone down because Britain was buying less cotton. People are going to move out of South Carolina, and remember, anytime you lose population, you're losing political power. And so there's a tariff that comes up in 1828. It is going to be called by Southerners, particularly South Carolina, the Tariff of Abominations. Their problem with it was that it taxed British clothing coming into the United States. And again, we understand that farmers dislike tariffs for 2 reasons. One, they're going to have to buy inferior American goods for more expensive than they should be. And on top of that, they're going to have to deal with the ramifications of trying to sell in other markets particularly once those other countries raised their tariffs. And so they were particularly aggrieved because they felt that it reduced the British demand for their cotton, on top of the fact that they had, paid more for imports. So South Carolina has an ace in the hole. They have John Calhoun, who was actually the vice president under John Quincy Adams and under Andrew Jackson. Now, he secretly writes the South Carolina Exposition and Protest, and in it he claims that the tariff of 1828 favors northeastern textile manufacturing over southern agriculture, which is not a new argument, namely about who tariffs help. But he claimed that states could actually nullify or veto a law that had been passed. Now, this, of course, goes back to what we saw with the Alien and Sedition Acts. Virginia and Kentucky resolution said this is, illegal. We can nullify it, and that ultimately went nowhere, except for the fact that in 1803, John Marshall said in Marbury v. Madison, no, actually, we have the ability to say if a law is unconstitutional or not, but it doesn't matter. South Carolina is making this argument, and so we're going to go sort of through their whole legal thinking. Andrew Jackson points out, states, you can't really pick and choose which laws you want to follow. That would create national chaos. Now, it's going to be ironic because Andrew Jackson doesn't seem to have problems creating chaos in other situations. Now, you're going to see South Carolina's legal logic in something known as the Webster-Hayne debate. Now, South Carolina Senator Hayne, who's going to later be their governor, so we got to follow that, he's angered as what he sees as this sort of anti-slavery invasion of the South. And we're going to be talking more about 1831, where we get Nat Turner's rebellion in Virginia, but we also get the printing of The Liberator, which is the most sort of outspoken abolitionist publication in the Northeast. But there's really this feeling in the South like they're starting to be under attack. And Hayne is going to propose something that we actually had talked about a little earlier, which goes back to the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, which is what is known as compact theory. Namely, that the United States was created, or I should say the Constitution was created once there already were states. So it was really the states who came together in this compact to create this union. And in fact, it should be them that get to nullify laws. And if you persist, federal government, in shoving down our throat laws that we find unconstitutional, we can ultimately secede. Okay? That was Hayne's argument representing the South, particularly South Carolina. Now, Massachusetts Senator Webster, Daniel Webster, points out, he's like, no, you're missing it. It wasn't created by the states, but by the American people. It's we the people, not we the states. And if the states want to, nullify a federal law, that ultimately makes what he says the union be nothing but a rope of sand. It could just go away. It would vanish, and that's not possible. And he claimed that South Carolina's defiance of federal authority, ultimately, if you follow legal logic, was civil war. And famously, he mentioned these four words: liberty and union, now and forever. And what he was really saying was, we need to stay together as a union. You can't just sort of pick and choose what you want because you don't like it. We are a union committed to freedom, but not the individual freedom of the states. Most political leaders agreed that states couldn't actually separate from the government, and they couldn't act separately from the government. And Jackson looked at it and said, the Constitution is supreme to the states. And again, he's not somebody who always follows the Constitution, but in this case he said, we have a supremacy clause, you got to follow what is being said, South Carolina. Now, it's interesting because Andrew Jackson, you would think as a cotton planting Southerner, would have disliked the tariff. And in fact, he was sympathetic to South Carolina until they brought up nullification, because Andrew Jackson, at the end of the day, doesn't like to be questioned. And this was questioning his government. And in doing so, they made an enemy out of Jackson. Now, what happens in 1832 is that Jackson realizes, let's try to diffuse the situation a little bit. And he gets Congress to actually reduce the tariff of 1828. But it really doesn't affect the cotton pieces, okay? The cotton fabric coming in still has a tariff on it, and as a result, Britain still is keeping their tariffs, and it's hard for South Carolina to sell their cotton. Now, it's important to understand what South Carolina is dealing with. Not only were they dealing with the problems, again, from the panic of 1819 all the way through the 20s, but they had a higher proportion of slaves than any other southern state. And they looked at this tariff as really the beginning of the end, because they felt if that tariff, which they didn't like and they thought was unfair, dare they say even unconstitutional, was sort of shoved down their throat, then someday it would naturally follow that the Northerners could get rid of slavery. And again, it's sort of hard to get from point A to point B, but for them, they're so paranoid that they can see it happening. So they get together a convention and they pass what is known as the Ordinance of Nullification. They said, listen, we're going to do this. We're going to nullify it. And South Carolina is a state of its word, and they nullified. They nullified not only the abominations tariff of 28, but also this compromise, or this reduced tariff, I should say, in 32. And they threatened the government. They said, if federal agents try to come collect tariffs on the goods that are unloaded from Europe in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina will secede. They are calling their shot. Calhoun, who is still the vice president, resigns as vice president to come defend nullification theory and oppose Andrew Jackson. So he's actually going to go from vice president down to being a senator from South Carolina, and then it's going to go back to the Senate and sort of represent their voice of nullification. Now, Andrew Jackson is pissed at what South Carolina is doing with this ordinance of nullification. But publicly, he acts, moderately, which is really surprising for a guy that had been in so many duels and had such a temper. He says, nullification is insurrection, and ultimately insurrection leads to war, and so that means the other states have a right to put this insurrection down. He's trying to come up with a legal logic to actually use force against them. Privately, he says he wants to go kill them all in South Carolina, and people say, you are the president, Mr. Jackson. You can't do that. So ultimately, he does send soldiers in a warship to Charleston, and he's not doing it to fight them. He says he's doing it to protect the federal customs house that is there where tariffs are supposed to be collected. Now, Senator Hayne of the Hayne-Webster debate is now Governor Hayne, and he's going to mobilize the state militia. So now you've got federal troops coming in, you've got 10,000 militia that are lined up in case they need to go, and you've got real tension brewing, okay? So Andrew Jackson ups the ante by getting congressional authority to actually use the Army to force the compliance. This is known as the Force Bill. And Calhoun looks at this and says, this is pure presidential despotism. You're setting up for a war here. And do you hear the music? Oh, Henry Clay coming on the scene for his second compromise. So the great compromiser, Henry Clay, comes on the scene and he says, okay, we can resolve this. What do we need to do? South Carolina, you don't like the tariff. Federal government, you want them to follow the tariff. Okay, so he helps create what's known as the Compromise Tariff of 1833. And it helps out both sides because the tariff is actually going to be reduced over 10 years. And at the end of the day, South Carolina accepts it. They don't secede. The federal government wins because federal law is technically being followed. So Henry Clay has saved the day. Now, in the end, you got to think about this. This is this great scene. So Andrew Jackson is going to sign this compromise tariff. Okay, we're all done. But he also signs the Force Bill, sort of as an FU to South Carolina, saying, I can do this if I want. Now, South Carolina rescinds their nullification of the tariffs of 1828 and 1832, but then they nullify the Force Bill as their FU to Jackson and Congress. So again, you see people sort of saying, okay, we're going to compromise, but at the same time, the tension is still very much there. And Jackson pats himself on the back because he's like, I defended the Union and no shots were fired. And South Carolina's proud of itself because they're like, we got a lower tariff. We stood up to the federal government. But that tension is going to persist because the slave owners in the South feel like they are under siege. So right now it's 1833. The clock is ticking, friends. We're really only just under 3 decades from the Civil War, and we're going to see this play out in the 30s and the 40s and the 50s. Now, it's important to realize that out of all of this, there's some real opposition to Jackson, and it comes in the form of the Whigs. And I'll talk about the Whigs at the beginning of the next lecture.